the most powerful civilizations in the history of the world, ancient Egypt reigned supreme for more than 3,000 years. Settled around the Nile River in northeast Africa, the ancient Egyptians created huge pyramids, beautiful statues, detailed artwork, and a complex system of hieroglyphic writing. During their long history, they made advances in agriculture, architecture, and astronomy. And the many artifacts they left behind still capture our imaginations today. Before Egypt became an empire, it was divided into two kingdoms, the Upper Kingdom in the south and the Lower Kingdom in the north. These names may seem backwards to us, but they were named after the flow of the Nile River. It was upstream, and the Lower Kingdom was downstream. Around 3100 BC, about 5,000 years ago, a king named Narmer united the two kingdoms, creating an empire that would last thousands of years. To show that the kingdoms were equal, Narmer established a new city between them, Memphis. This unification marked the official beginning of Egypt as a civilization. The unification of Upper and Lower Egypt also gave Egypt control of the entire Nile River, and that was a key to its power. Without the Nile, there would have been no Egypt. Northeast Africa is almost completely desert and receives very little rain. In some areas, it may rain only once every few years. The Nile River provided the Egyptians with precious water, but also something else just as important: mud. Every year between June and September, the Nile River overflowed its banks, flooding the land on either side. But this annual flood was not a disaster. The people of Egypt looked forward to it. When the Nile flooded, it covered the fields on both sides with a layer of rich brown mud that could grow wheat, barley, and vegetables. When the river did not flood very much, the people would not be able to grow enough food. The Nile River provided other important resources as well. Mud from the riverbanks was used to make bricks. Papyrus plants growing along its edge were used to make paper, baskets, rope, and sandals. Even the water itself formed a sort of highway, allowing boats to transport people and goods from one end of the kingdom to the other. Because of the Nile, the Egyptians became shipbuilders. Their earliest ships were skiffs, made of bundles of papyrus reeds tied together. Air trapped in the hollow reeds helped these skiffs to float. The Egyptians would use long poles to push these early boats across the river. Later ships were made of wooden planks, with reeds stuffed into the cracks. At first they rowed, but later developed sails to allow the wind to blow their ships up and down the river. With these ships, the ancient Egyptians were able to trade with other countries around the Mediterranean Sea. They also became explorers, traveling as far as the east coast of Africa and crossing the Indian Ocean. The Nile River was so important to the people of ancient Egypt that their calendar was based on it. They divided the year into 3 seasons: inundation, when the Nile would flood; growing, when it was time to plant crops; and harvest.
Concurrently and simultaneously during the Pyramid Age, there are great things happening in West Africa, but we very seldom. There are nations known as Dar-Tichit. Dar-Tichit would geographically presently be located where Ghana is. We had the Nak culture, which is where we today would call Nigeria. We have the Monomotapan Empire in what today we call Zimbabwe. There are over 300 stone structures in southern Africa. And then you have that great structure in the great Zimbabwe that shows a direct relationship to the Grand Lodge of Luxor in Egypt. You have Puanit, which is in today's Somalia, Ethiopia. You have the Kush empires that are simultaneously happening. When Hatshepsut, the great Pharaoh king, although she was a woman, she was a Pharaoh king, sitting on the throne of Kemet, her cousin sits on the throne of Puanit, or what we call Somalia. There are great things happening historically across the African continent. You have the kingdoms of Kuba and Luba in Central Africa. Suleiman taught Mozart. Who's Suleiman? Suleiman's a Moor. He's an African. Who is Beethoven? Beethoven was Thoven Bey. He was a Moor.
His mother was a Moor. Yes. And when he went deaf, that melanin kicked in. The inner eye kicked in. He heard music better when he was deaf than he heard it otherwise.
There's a book about him called Beethoven's Hair, because people were so infatuated with the texture of his hair. So that African bloodline runs real deep throughout Europe. And again, he was called a Moor, and the Moors were very important throughout Europe. And it's funny, the importance of the Moor was so deep in Europe, but we rarely hear about them in history books today.
You see reference to Moors throughout African history. You see reference to Moors over here in American history.
The Moors were African men who went into Europe around 711 AD, and they really civilized Europe, because Europe was going through a dark age. Europe was really struggling because after the Vandals had basically destroyed Rome, everything was backwards over there. So the Moors went in and they ushered in the Renaissance era. They brought in science, mathematics, astrology. They brought all of this into Europe.
They are bringing in hot and cold running water. They are bringing in concepts of what we call a cosmopolitan city. They are lighting the streets by lamps. In Cordova, you know, they built an entire city where the streets for miles you could walk with lamps that lit the street at night. And they had raised sidewalks where people could walk. The kings and queens of Europe lived in barns. Nobody wants to admit that. But they lived in barns. They lived with the animals. And another thing that the Africans brought in was that they said, you know, you cannot let your chicken run around in your house, and them cows got to go outside. So they created what's called corrals. And corral is an Ethiopian word. It's a K-R-A-L sound. Corral, which is where they would put their animals after they domesticated them. Europeans let them animals run all up and down. This is where the German measles come from. This is where chickenpox come from. Because Europeans did not have a place for their animals. They just ran all up inside their places. And they would carry, as they would get illnesses and sicknesses, they did not bathe, so therefore they had no soap, they had no disinfectant, didn't have alcohol, so that this type of style of living brought illness. When the Moors came in, they wrapped all that up along with bringing medicine. What you have happening is that these Gothic kingdoms are going to bring down, they're going to sack the Roman Empire. And after they sack the Roman Empire, they're going to take this area over for a while. And then the Moors are going to come in and they're going to push those Visigoths out. And they're going to push them more north, and they're going to chase them out of the southern part of the Iberian Peninsula. And that's where the Moors are going to inhabit from 710 until 1492, January 2nd to be exact, when the last great king, Boabdil, was chased out of Granada.
The term Moor started to become interchangeable with the term black, because it was basically the same thing. But when the slave trade started, they tried to objectify black people, Moorish people. So they would use the term interchangeably, and they would just switch on to calling people black. But if you look at a lot of old documents, there's even slave ships called Blackamoor. If you look at slave records, there was even a boxer out of Virginia who was very popular in the early 1800s named Tom Molyneux, and his nickname was the Moor. So that name was definitely used interchangeably with black or Negro at that time.
Moor means black, like Negro, Ethiopian. Moor means black. Moor is not a people. Moor is a color. And they have taken this word Moor and they have associated Moor with Muslim. There were Moors that weren't Muslim. Moor means black. There were Christian Moors. There were Moors that practiced a traditional African faith system. So that Moor means black, simple. Moors brought in this knowledge into Europe. Africans brought this knowledge into Europe. And peoples of European descent were exposed to alchemy, okay? The periodic table of elements, the laboratory, how to take information, how to take elements and atoms, and to begin to manipulate them to make them into different types of molecules. The basic one is hydrogen, 2 hydrogen is helium, 3 hydrogen is lithium, 6 is carbon, 8 is oxygen. So you have this alchemy that's going to come, and they're going to begin to study, they're going to begin to learn, they're going to create societies that's going to develop an understanding. This is going to be what eventually is going to become Freemasonry, because only a select group of people in Europe is going to be exposed to this information. What we today call Islam, Arabic didn't exist. Arabic was the language of the Quran. And that came out of Africans. That Spanish and French and Portuguese, Italian, Romanian, these languages would codify themselves once the Moors came in and brought civilization and brought in a semblance of language and syntax. They then would take Latin and they would branch off, and then you would have Spanish. That's why all of the languages are related to Latin. That's why they call the Latin languages.
A lot of the European royal family's coat of arms, you can clearly see depictions of Moors. Many of the original castles of Europe were built by the Moors. There are many Moorish castles in Spain, Italy, England, and some of these castles, they can be seen in Africa as well. A lot of people don't know that there are castles all throughout Ethiopia. We never see that on television. We always see the cats and the dudes in the mud huts and people starving in Ethiopia, but there are very well-designed castles all over Ethiopia. And a lot of the Moors, you can see pictures and paintings of them in castles in Europe. You can look at old paintings and see this.
What you are looking at when you see the cathedrals, that's all Moorish architecture, taken to the extent to the next level. In fact, we know for a fact all of the cathedrals that you see built in England, the island of England, were built by the Moors.
By the time the Moors got into Europe, the illiteracy rate was very high because there was no practical reason for people to read at the time, because people were really trying to survive. So the only people who could read at the time were monks or religious figures. So the Moors went into Europe and they started to establish universities.
The first university created in Europe, the University of Salamanca. They created the education system that Europe adopted. They brought in what became classical music. They're the ones who brought architecture and fineries. They were, in fact, everywhere in Europe sent their best to go and learn there, just like they sent them to Timbuktu, just like they sent them over to Luxor, just like they sent them over to where all these areas where you see Africans and high sciences were. They sent them there to Spain to learn.
Well, the Moors brought in the first music conservatory into Valencia, Spain. They brought Ziryab into Spain, and he brought in a chordophone known as the lute, L'-O-U-D. We call it lute, L-U-T-E. It's a chordophone, and it has 4 chords. And you know, the hormones of the body, the humors, Africans would heal people when you had clogs in your liquid systems, okay? Whether it was your mucus, or whether it was your hormones, whether it was your phlegm, whether it was your blood, whatever was clogged up, what they do is that they would put this chordophone over your body and they would strum, right? And in strumming, the vibration of the string would open up whatever was clogged, okay? Ziryab, in his brilliance, added a 5th string. And this 5th string was for plasma, which is invisible liquid, which is the origin of the universe. And this just healed your entire system, your entire body. When you look at a piano is a harp turned sideways. That's why when you look at a baby grand piano, it's shaped like a harp. Then you take the top up and you put a stick there so that it's open, right? So that Africans said that instead of strumming strings to make the sound, what they would do is they would put it to its side, encase it in wood, and then you would hit keys. And the keys then would hit the strings, and it would be a different kind of sound. And so when you're looking at Baroque music, which Bach is really given credit for developing, that came out of Africa. Okay, Africa. In fact, Africans have the finger piano that they play. All they did was take the concept of the finger piano, the xylophone, and this harp turned sideways, and that became piano. Out of that came what we call classical music. And this is why when I hear African folk talk about, because I enjoy classical music. I play classical music, I enjoy listening to classical music, but that's black music, that's soul music. And black folk used classical music as soul music, but Europeans took it. And so now when we look at what we call classical music, Tchaikovsky, or Beethoven, or Mozart, or any of the so-called classical pianists or classical musicians, we say, oh man, that's white music. That's not white music. We don't know our history.
Black history is taught like this. You started off as a slave, then white folks felt bad and decided to free you. Then civil rights legislation made you equal. And finally, you achieved victory with Obama's election. The end. Of course, that is ridiculous. That is the white supremacist version of Black history. The end result of this miseducation is that Black children are separated from their own people's legacy and historical achievements. Everybody in the world has the right to draw inspiration from their own people's legacy. And this right is robbed from Black children because their history is actively hidden, distorted, and replaced with make-believe. For this video, we will carefully cover the facts on how Black people became liberated from American chattel slavery. The miseducational system has taught us three gigantic myths about the freeing of the slaves. The first myth is that there was only some slave rebellions here and there, but not any kind of large-scale military resistance to slavery initiated and carried out by Black men. The second myth is that any slaves who wanted freedom basically fled north to be granted freedom. The third myth is that the Civil War was the primary event that ended chattel slavery. The reality is that there was a series of battles, revolts, and rebellions that lasted from 1739 to 1858. This was the Gullah Wars. That is more than 100 years of warfare totally hidden from the American history books. A lot of this history was disguised as the Seminole Wars. First of all, the Seminoles were not a real Native American tribe. They were Native Americans allied with and often led by Black Africans. Seminole literally means runaway. Maroon means fugitive. Gullah refers to the Black Africans. The Emancipation Proclamation was a staged event, and it was designed to stop and historically hide the self-liberation process of Africans in America. Africans were brought into the Anglo-American New World Order, and many of these Africans maintained the goal to kill, crush, and destroy white supremacy. 1739, the Gullah War begins. Carolina was about to pass the Security Act, which would require whites to be armed more often to prevent a slave uprising. So the slaves decided that this was the time to strike. About 20 of them went to the local store, stocked up on guns and ammo, killed the shopkeeper, and began the Stonewall Rebellion. The rebels marched, and as they marched, their following grew larger and larger. They chanted out liberty as they marched, chasing the slave owners, killing them, and burning their houses down. After the rebellion, South Carolina passed the Negro Act, which prevented a future rebellion by limiting the rights of the slaves. From that point in time until 1812, the Gullah were fighting continuous battles against the state militia in Florida. Spain was fighting against the American colonists for land in Florida. The Spanish started arming the Gullah and providing them with military training. The Gullah used this military equipment and training to defend their own free, independent Black towns. The first Black town in North America was called Garcia Real de Santa Teresa de Mose. It was built by the Black man and officially recognized later by the Spanish Lieutenant General Montillano in 1738. This Black town was a place that slaves could escape to have their own land and receive military training. 1814, Andrew Jackson defeated the Native American Creek Confederation. He imposed on them the Treaty of Fort Jackson, which basically stole their land. So Chief Sakafoka led thousands of his warriors to Florida and joined forces with the mighty Gullah Nation. The so-called Indian Wars were actually the Gullah Wars. General Thomas Jessup said, "Throughout my operations, I found the Negroes the most active and determined warriors, and during the conferences with the Indian chief, I ascertained that they exercised an almost controlling influence over them. This, you may be assured, is a Negro and not an Indian war." 1816, the Battle of Negro Fort. Negro Fort was a structure built by the British and occupied and led by black gullahs. Andrew Jackson ordered Colonel Clinch to destroy Negro Fort. After they destroyed Negro Fort, Andrew Jackson ordered the torture of the leaders and the enslavement of the black captives. This was a historical turning point in Gullah military strategy. The Gullah leaders who escaped decided that they would never again use the British strategy of fighting from a fixed fortified position. They decided instead that they would return to using the traditional Gullah method of guerrilla warfare, which involved striking and vanishing, luring the enemy into strange areas. The forest, the pasture, the swamp. They had the advantage with decentralized warfare because they knew the land better. As more and more slaves, the mighty Gullah nation. The so-called Indian Wars were actually the Gullah Wars. General Thomas Jessup said, "Throughout my operations, I found the Negroes the most active and determined warriors, and during the conferences with the Indian chief, I ascertained that they exercised an almost controlling influence over them. This, you may be assured, is a Negro and not an Indian war." 1816, the Battle of Negro Fort. Negro Fort was a structure built by the British and occupied and led by black gullahs. Andrew Jackson ordered Colonel Clinch to destroy Negro Fort. After they destroyed Negro Fort, Andrew Jackson ordered the torture of the leaders and the enslavement of the black captives. This was a historical turning point in Gullah military strategy. The Gullah leaders who escaped decided that they would never again use the British strategy of fighting from a fixed fortified position. They decided instead that they would return to using the traditional Gullah method of guerrilla warfare, which involved striking and vanishing, luring the enemy into strange areas. The forest, the pasture, the swamp. They had the advantage with decentralized warfare because they knew the land better. As more and more slaves fled south for freedom, thousands of U.S. soldiers died at the hands of the superior Gullah warriors. 1818, the Battle of Suwanee. A stretch of towns along the Suwanee River was occupied by a series of self-sufficient Native American and Gullah colonies. Once again, General Andrew Jackson came to terrorize and invade them. The Gullah and the Native American warriors, allied in the swamps, inflicted heavy damage on the invading army. Andrew Jackson was defeated by the Gullahs, however, he fraudulently claimed the battle as a victory. After the Gullah warriors and their allies disappeared into the swamps, Andrew Jackson exacted revenge against them by slaughtering a nearby settlement of their women and children. The killing of women and children was the only victory Andrew Jackson achieved in the Battle of Suwanee. This black history was actively hidden. Whenever the word black or Negro or African were mentioned in war reports, the words were simply omitted or replaced with an asterisk. The Gullah Wars were also hidden from the newspapers so they wouldn't scare away potential European settlers. Real American history shows that the black man was destroying the institution of slavery. 1822, the resistance had grown completely out of control of the United States government. In Charleston, South Carolina, almost all the slaves in the area had joined a movement to carry out a massive slave revolt. What white people had not considered is that every time you capture a free Gullah warrior and sell him into slavery, the Gullah warrior will only spread his own knowledge amongst the new slaves he's living with. This rebellion was to be led by Denmark Vesey and his lieutenant Peter Poyas. 9,000 slaves were planning to revolt that day. However, the revolt never actually took place because cowardly black people involved with the movement informed the white colonists of these plans. Everyone involved ended up being executed or sold away to another plantation. 1835, the victory over the King Fort Relief, otherwise known as the Dade Massacre. The reason it was recorded as a massacre instead of a battle was to hide the fact that it was a legitimate military victory for the Black Gullah. Also in 1835, the U.S. Army suffered another defeat at the Withlacoochee River, forcing General Gaines to leave Florida. 1837, Colonel Taylor claimed the Battle of Lake Okeechobee as a victory for the United States. In reality, the Gullah warriors and the Native Americans had already started fleeing the area and spreading the Gullah resistance to other parts of America. The real war that ended slavery was not the Civil War, it was the Gullah Wars. It was Native Americans and Black Muslim Gullahs against the white Christian colonists. The so-called Civil War was carried out for elitist banking and business interests, and it also served as a formality, a ceremonial ending to chattel slavery. In reality, slavery ended in America because it couldn't be maintained against the constant guerrilla attacks, and the only way to stop those attacks was to make slavery illegal. The free black man would not tolerate slavery. Therefore, it came to an end.